And then my dad comes into this meeting, and instead of telling him how he's reconciling with his family or attempting to reconcile with his family, instead of my dad being like, hey, this is what I'm going to do about the addiction issues that I have, he proceeds to, for an hour and a half, talk about how he had gotten a prophetic word from God giving Bill Johnson permission to date this woman. And I am absolutely shell shocked the whole time. It was like the last time I was like truly, truly shocked by something my father did.
Welcome to the Bad Fruit Podcast. I am your host, Jonathan, and the Bad Fruit Podcast is the podcast that looks at the bad fruit in the modern evangelical megachurch. We've had experts, authors, insiders, those who have been banned. We've had pastors and some of our friends as well. Today, I am joined by a very special guest, Jedidiah Hartley. He's the son of Bob Hartley, who is one of the prophets at IHOP Kansas City, which stands for International House of Prayer in Kansas City. Jedidiah has been bravely speaking out about the abuse that he saw firsthand growing up in this community. And he was gracious enough to come on the Bad Fruit Podcast and share his experiences, his stories. We discussed a wide range of topics, including Bethel and Bill Johnson. And we also talked about SOZO and the Prophetic. Before we continue, I want to say that some parts of this may be hard to hear. We discuss abuse, and some of the language may not be appropriate for all listeners. I want those who may be sensitive to this kind of language or content to know that before going into it, and that this may not be an episode for younger listeners. However, I do think that there is a lot of value in hearing these stories and hearing what is actually going on within this world. Because there is abuse, there's manipulation, there's control, there's a desire for power, and there are fraudulent people who are taking advantage of others. And that is why I think Jedidiah's stories are so important to share. I really enjoyed my time with Jedidiah, and I just want to thank him one more time for being on the podcast. And I also want to thank you for listening to the Bad Fruit Podcast. Jedidiah is one of the founders of the Rise and Reclaim Advocacy Group. I'm going to link that in the show notes as well as on our Facebook page. Our Facebook page, by the way, is facebook.com/badfruitpodcast. You can also email us at badfruitpodcast@gmail.com. Those will also be linked in our show notes below. All right, on to the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Jedidiah, for joining me, and I hope that you will find value and enjoy this episode. Well, welcome to the Bad Fruit Podcast, and today I am joined by, you're an author, and you're one of the founders of the Rise and Reclaim Advocacy Group, and your name is Jedidiah Hartley. Do you go by Jedidiah or Jed?
I go by Jedidiah. I go by Jed. I'm also a tutor, and all of my students call me Mr. Jedi, so, I go by
Ooh, I like that, Mr. Jedi.
all the variations, yeah.
This is not the podcast you're looking for.
Right.
Well, how are you doing today? Are you doing all right?
I'm doing good. Yeah, I've had a good day so far. Excited to be on here.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join me. I was kind of thinking maybe we could start with you maybe telling us a little bit about who you are. Some people may not know who you are. I know that you've been on some other podcasts, and
sure,
You've been talking with John Collins on a couple episodes of his podcast, which I'll link to on our Facebook page, and it's a really good conversation that you've been having with him. I appreciate you coming on the Bad Fruit Podcast, and yeah, so kind of who are you, Mr. Jedi?
I am someone who grew up in kind of at the epicenter of a couple different charismatic mega churches. I grew up with the International House of Prayer. For those who are familiar with it, like that was my parents were pretty core in the foundation of the International House of Prayer, and I grew up running around. There was like the early IHOP buildings for people who remember it, but it was before it became the sort of mega church that it was. It was um, a place that was cobbled together with like a few different trailers that had been pieced together to make this weird sort of office building. And my dad actually owned that building.
Okay.
So I spent like I was homeschooled and I spent much of my childhood in that actual building. Um, and then my father has had a very, um, at times, very prominent prophetic ministry. And uh, in his sort of prophetic ministry, he would travel to a lot of different churches, speak at places. The big ticket churches were, of course, Bethel in Redding, California, and Morning Star in North Carolina, and H Rock in California. And I would often travel with him, both as a teenager and even into my early 20s. And I was kind of on the circuit with him. And so I saw a lot of the behind the scenes sort of world of the sort of non denominational charismatic mega churches, especially the ones that are really heavy into gifts of the spirit, into prophecy, into end times, sort of apocalyptic, very radical communities. And so yeah, I saw all of that firsthand, and then within this last couple of years, um, it's obviously a very long story, but just the short gist of it is that I actually have come forward and spoken about how my father was um, a fraud in the prophetic community, and and he was not alone in that, but that he would get information off of like Facebook, or get information from uh, say we were going to a church. If he knew people who were at that church, he would ask them questions about different individuals in the church, write it down in notebooks, and then get up and preach and pretend as if he got that information from God divinely. And this became a very big grift that he was doing for quite a while. And quite unfortunately, like over the last like 10 years, I've seen a lot of the slow descent of my father into more like fraudulent behaviors, and then some pretty abusive behaviors where he was using his authority to abuse different people. And so there came a time where I just had to speak up against it. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from. But of course, there's a much longer story behind that. But that's the
Sure.
short gist of it.
Right. And I know you've told the story on a few different podcasts. If anybody's interested, I'll try to point them to some of those places where you've maybe shared it in more detail. I'm curious, before we get into some of the things that I really, really want to talk about with you, but I am kind of curious. The kind of the grift that you were just talking about sounds a lot like recently Sean Bowles have been kind of in the news for basically doing the same thing. And so I was actually kind of curious, is Sean Bowles someone that was kind of around you? Is this kind of a normal grift within that charismatic world? Is it just your dad and Sean, or was it like, is this kind of a rampant thing going on?
Yeah. So 3 years ago, or even 2 years ago, I would have probably answered this question a lot differently. I always knew to some extent that my dad wasn't the only one. He wasn't the fraudster amongst a group of honest people. There were other known individuals who were doing it, and growing up, it was always the question of, now, are these individuals doing some what they call, I've talked about this before, but like in different podcasts, but they would call it hamburger helper is the term that
I've heard
Bob
that, yeah.
Jones, yeah. But it was this idea that like the little something extra to help the meat of the prophecy is like you're making a full meal and some people add something extra. And it was kind of talked about in a way that was like definitely not condoned, or sorry, not spoken positively of, but it was like, yeah, it's we all do it. It's like speeding or something like that. It's like you shouldn't break the rule, but a lot of people do. It's more authentic. Or like I think a good example would be like people using chat gpt now in when writing emails and stuff like that.
Sure.
It's like I shouldn't become too reliant on it. It's a little like questionable, but it's just helping me articulate the things. And it's really my voice. It's not this other thing. I think that like that's how it felt
Okay.
growing up was everybody was doing it. It was just a measure of like to what extent. And I think that that's where I was seeing my father and I was like, nah, this is all fabricated. And this is like he's having emotional moments with stuff. Like he would get up on stage and he would talk about something that I had given him information on, not even intentionally knowing, like we would be traveling and I would be talking about people I had met or something like that, or giving him little bits of information, or I was there in the conversation when we were talking to like the family that was hosting us. And he would be up on stage and he would have this very performative and very convincing experience where or instances where he would pause and very dramatically like look as if he was like contending and pulling something down from the heavens, and he would stare right at the person unblinking, just very um convicted, and he would be like, you you lost a friend, didn't you? And they would like burst into tears. And meanwhile, we had just talked with a host family that told us that this individual had their best friend die the previous year, or something to
Sure.
that
Yeah.
effect. Anyway, he was doing it very extreme in these
Mm.
instances, and I thought that. So if you had asked me 3 years ago, I would have been like, I think he's the only one who's doing it quite on that level. Um, Turns out that is definitely not true. There was basically there's a whole thread of individual. I think there's other threads from different locations, but there was a whole thread of people who came from Kansas City and the Kansas City prophets and descended sort of from this lineage of prophets. Sean Bowles is one of them. Sean Bowles was in that thread of the Kansas City prophets. Chris Reed is like loosely connected to it. You had Paul Kane, you had Bob Jones, you had Mike Bickle, you had all of these different individuals who it has now come out that all of them were doing this to some extent, and in very, very similar and sort of heartbreaking ways that my father was doing it, where it was quite overt. It wasn't just like little bits and pieces here. It was like telling people the most like intimate details of their life that they had gotten from either other people or online, and pretending, like looking them dead in the face and pretending that God gave that to them.
As we heard recently with some of the stuff that's come out about Sean Bowles, and like there was a prophecy about this girl. We did an episode a couple episodes ago, Jubilee Dawn. We talked about her.
Yeah.
He gives this prophecy, and unfortunately, there's actual real life impact of the prophecy. It's not just, hey, I think you're gonna have a great day. And, you're gonna conquer the giant in your life. Like some of that stuff's just kind of, I don't know. It's just
Right.
general things that
Fortune cookie.
yeah. And like, I don't know, that's not necessarily life changing or bad, but some of these are truly devastating things. And as we've kind of been coming out, and so, yeah, I mean, if you build your whole prophecy off of stuff you found online and you're not actually receiving it from God, yeah, you could send people down some really dark paths. And yeah, it's truly truly sad. This actually leads to a kind of a question that I was kind of curious your thoughts on. People like your dad, Bob Hartley, and Bob Jones, and you mentioned Mike Bickle and Sean Bowles, and I might even throw like Randy Clark and Bill
Yeah.
Johnson in there and stuff. I mean, obviously, I'm asking your opinion here, so feel free to whatever. But are they grifters? Do they even believe in this stuff themselves? And kind of a follow up with that, I'm kind of curious your opinion on it. But do you think some of them started like with genuineness? Like, I mean, I guess to your fathers, you could probably maybe speak more to that, or maybe even Mike Bickle. But like, do you think that they started genuinely wanting to help people and hear God's voice, and then it just like there's almost this perpetuation of it. It's like I want people to think that I hear God's voice, so I'm gonna make people think I'm hearing it, and maybe eventually I really will. I don't know. It's kind of a question that I've been wondering a lot about this kind of charismatic world.
Yeah, well, so I can speak more insightfully on like my own father's motivations in a place where I'm like, this is not, of course all of it is from my frame of reference in my opinion,
Sure.
but I can speak knowledgeably about how I've seen that with my dad. I have larger opinions, so I'll give my first sort of larger opinion on this.
Yeah, go for it.
And I think that I think that the perspective that I have that differs probably from a lot of individuals who are viewing this is that I don't know if I would ever say the God that these individuals are worshiping is the same God that some of the people within the community are worshiping. Like
Sure.
at the core of it, I think that these men worship power and they worship themselves in that power. So I think that like I've said this before somewhere, but I did not grow up with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I grew up with the God of Bob Hartley, Bob Jones, and Mike Bickle.
Yeah.
And they casted. Again, this is my opinion.
Sure.
But I believe that they casted an idol in their own image. Like they constructed these images of God. And then they put Jesus's name and face on it, but it was just them. Like it's just it's the Nebuchadnezzar, statue, and then it's just said to be of Jesus. And when you ask them about the attributes of their God, they just describe them. Like it's something that's highly specific and highly tailored to their own ideology of what they think they ought to be and what they want to be. And so when people are like, was Bill Johnson ever genuine? Was Bob Hartley ever genuine? More and more, it's getting to the place where I'm like, they were always genuine in their pursuit of this God. It's just that God is not the same God that you and I are thinking of. It's not the same God
Sure.
that we're talking about. And obviously it's, it's messy at times, but like, I think that's why when all of this comes out and there are clear violations of like deep betrayals of character and deep betrayals of like the flock and the community, you see these individuals being unfazed. And it's like, well, if they did believe in the God that they kind of are pretending to believe in, or the God that we kind of think of,
Sure.
it's not possible. Like like you you can't. I mean, just fear of God alone. Like, there's been so many different
Right.
individuals who have come forward who have used the name of God to sexually abuse individuals. Like, and
Mhm.
that's and, and to abuse and deceive and to make money and just all of these forms of corruption. And they did it with the name of God on their lips. And like, if you believe in God, you got to be terrified. Like one day you're going to be held accountable to the fact that like you
Right.
used God's name to abuse people. If you believe in that God, you're kind of you're in
Yeah.
a rough spot. You're in a rough spot.
Right.
And you just don't see any sense of fear. You don't see any sense of reverence from these individuals. And so to me, that is communicated um, a an irreverence towards the God that I sort of once knew, the belief of the God that like who cares about the poor and the widow and the orphan, and who cares about the vulnerable, and who cares about truth and justice, and cares about
Right.
these core virtues. Um,
Right.
so yeah, so I genuinely like I don't necessarily I think sometimes people are like, did Bob Jones and Bill Johnson get together and be like, these suckers, we're gonna take them for all we can, and we're gonna get money, and we're gonna build hotels, and we're gonna have flocks of women who we can tell them to do what we. I don't think so. I don't think in like a
Sure.
overt way, but I think that it's like I don't ever think that there was this genuine sense of like, I want to spread the love of Jesus to all corners of the earth and any way that I can. And like, I just don't, I think the people who have that genuine, and I've seen a lot of people in the communities that I've been raised in who have that genuine sense of like, I want to share the good news of the gospel to everyone. And like, I want to build something unto the glorification of God and God alone. And they don't last in these communities. They don't make it to the top. Those are not the individuals who become the lead prophetic pastors and the lead evangelists. It just like I have seen that happen, and like those who have outstanding character are not the ones who are gaining leadership and position.
We've kind of joked about it before on this podcast with my brother, and it's this idea that the gospel doesn't sell, the gospel doesn't make any
Hmm.
money,
Hmm.
and so you don't ever hear these mega churches, whether it's the IHOP type stuff where it's hyper charismatic type things, or even just sort of the vanilla Joel Osteen kind of just feel
Right.
good stuff. You just don't really ever hear them actually preaching the gospel.
Yeah.
And I think when part of the reason for that is that it's just not profitable, like you're saying.
Yeah.
And the gospel is radical. The gospel is this amazing message.
Hmm.
And that's one of the things for why I'm doing this podcast and why we've been doing it is, I find so much danger in these false doctrines, and I want to be. I feel like Christians myself, should be some of the strongest voices calling
Hmm.
out our own, like we should be cleaning our own house kind of situation, and it's sad that it takes a lot of people who have deconstructed and left Christianity
Hmm.
to be the stronger voices. And I'm like, actually, no, like you guys have some really great points. Like we need to be listening to you because you saw this stuff firsthand. And so I think there's so much value in examining this and saying, this stuff is going on. We need to call this out. We need to make sure that people are aware of these dangerous doctrines, dangerous. And it's not even just from a doctrinal standpoint of like,
Right.
oh, I'm right and you're wrong, but
Yeah.
like doctrines have consequences. And
Yeah.
the other part of the gospel doesn't, make money is that the gospel doesn't hurt people either. So when you're actually living out the true gospel, I mean, there's so much that the apostles Paul and James, they write about. Hey, by the way, did you take care of the widows and orphans? Hey, by the way, if
Hmm.
send some money and food to so and so because they're hurting. There's so much of that, and Jesus' message is so much about. Yes, it's eternal. all this stuff, but there's also this message of caring for the widows and orphans and things like that. And when that's your focus, when that's your gospel, like, people are not going to actually be hurt. They're going to be helped. But the message, the gospel that's being preached by so many of these people is so dangerous. And, whether it's, oh, you guys are going to be healed and you just don't have enough faith and, don't take your medication anymore. I mean, it's just crazy, some of the stuff that people are saying.
Yeah.
And that's not God. That isn't God. And so I completely agree with you. That is not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That is not, my Christ, because my Christ loves those people and cares for those people.
Yeah,
So.
no, and I think I think that you're totally right. Where you're like that the gospel doesn't make money, like doesn't provide profit for those who peddle it,
Right.
And I think because it's not that it's not that like a genuine, authentic gospel centered around the idea of like compassion, empathy, liberation, and like the virtues is not something that can spread. And especially, I think that like in communities. So I did a lot of missions work. Also, I was at YWAM. Do you know what YWAM is? Are people familiar with YWAM?
So I'm here in Springfield, Missouri, and so Kansas City stuff. When you talk about that, that's not too far from here. And I
Right.
think we have some YWAM stuff that's actually kind of in Branson, which isn't too far from here. And so, anyways, yeah, we know about YWAM around here.
It's all over. Everybody who's like in the evangelical charismatic world has at least a friend or a friend of a friend who has been a part of YWAM, because it's one of the bigger like missions movements in America, or like in Christian American culture. And so I traveled and with that organization, and I saw different expressions of Christianity, much different expressions of Christianity. Whenever you get like overseas, it's just it totally changes. Might as well be a different religion,
Right.
because the politics of the world and like the background and the history, the historical context, everything, it all switches. And I've seen, especially for people groups who are or communities who are being oppressed or downtrodden. Like I always think about the fact that like in the United States, you go back 200 years or whatever, and or less than that even, and you have either Jim Crow era or before that, like slavery, and you have on a plantation, you could have both the slavers and the slaves all believing the same religion, which is, it feels weird, right? Like that they're reading from the same book, and on one end you have this sort of like liberation gospel of this like the people who are enslaved, who are reading about Moses and reading about God delivering his people out of captivity, and hearing and resonating with these stories about hope and liberation, and if not liberation in this day and in the day to come. And then you have the slavers who are using the Bible to like talk about generational curses and talk about like the nature of man in order to like subjugate, and that there are like it is the sort of dominion of this destiny of this group of individuals to subjugate the land and subjugate its peoples, and that Christ has given these slavers authority to like own people, right? And the
Right,
fact
yeah.
and I do think right now in the United States, I think that we're seeing sort of a manifestation of that. I don't want to say that it's like total black and white pole. Like I think that it's just you have this swirling religious context that is both the religion of the slaves and the religion of the slavers. And like one is about power and one is about freedom. And I grew up seeing a great deal of individuals be enticed and seduced to the gospel of power and the gospel of
Yeah.
subjugation and the gospel of like dominionism. Like I
Mhm.
went to a school that was called Dominion Christian School. Like
Yeah.
it was pretty explicit that it's like, this is our land that God has given us, and this is our nation, and we have to like take it back. Um and then in conjunction with that, you see these people on like a more microcosmic level, like the patriarchs of the community taking total power of their communities. And this is what is happening now, is that when it was like, okay, clearly they abused that power, there is like zero sense of repercussions, zero sense of accountability baked in within the system. Like the only accountability is coming from like external pressure. There is no sense of like urgency or justice from like when the whole Mike Bickle scandal happened. You had pastors calling it, nothing burgers, and that it doesn't matter. And like this was a man who was grooming women from teenage years on, like just
Yeah.
incredible, horrific things that were going on. I saw it happen with my father too. Like I speak out about like some really, really terrible and atrocious things that my dad is doing, and spoke with Bill Johnson directly about this. And it was just kind of like, yeah, well, we cover people. We care about, we care about your dad. And it was all just like centered around whether or not my dad was doing well. And I was like, who gives a shit? Like he
Yeah.
caused this, like, it's not about him. He's the abuser in this situation. And like, I mean, also it's better for him if he's held accountable for these things. Like it doesn't do him any good to let him off the hook and let him continue to like have this sort of corrosive, toxic behavior. But yeah, it's just totally wild.
I appreciate you sharing all of that and your experiences and all of that. I think one of the problems with the sort of larger non-denominational charismatic movement is the lack of accountability.
Mhm.
We've seen abuse within the Catholic Church. We've seen abuse
Right.
within the Southern Baptist Convention that kind of came out a couple years ago when things started coming out. Abuse can happen in any organization, in any group, right? Because and that doesn't necessarily mean that the organization itself is evil or bad. It's just there's going to be bad actors, and we're part of this world. People are bad in this world, right? Like it's just a reality. Like there's just some people that are just not good people. But I think one of the things is, so like, okay, I go to a LCMS Lutheran church, right? We have some accountability to the LCMS church. So if something were to happen with my pastor or with another, pastor in the area, there is some level of accountability there. We want to preach the gospel. That's kind of Lutherans like to, one of our things is, love God and serve others. Like that's the core Lutheran thing, right? Like there's a lot of great Lutheran charities out there because that's a core focus of who we are. Yeah. So we don't want abuse. So if abuse happens, we're going to remove those people. It's not going to persist. And I think within the non-denominational world, and especially within the charismatic, is one level there isn't accountability. They're all kind of self-proclaimed prophets and apostles, and they're all like this loose network, but they're not really united. And then also there's this idea of, well, if I'm speaking for God, then what I'm saying is true, or that person's claiming to speak for God. So I don't want to touch the Lord's anointing. That's a big thing that they say a lot is, don't touch the Lord's anointing, totally abusing scripture. So it's really sad that this situation is even happening. And I think this is just my opinion, but I think a lot of that has to do with the lack of structure and founding documents or doctrines within that. Yeah. So, like as a Lutheran, we have the Augsburg Confession, the Book of Concord, like, right. That's our founding documents of doctrine. And if somebody veers off doctrinally from that, we can be like, oh, well, you're still a Christian, but you're outside of this. So, you're not a Lutheran anymore, or you're not like our kind of Lutheran or whatever. Whereas there's nothing like that even within the charismatic world. It's literally just whatever God tells you today is the truth, And so it's just crazy to me. I don't know.
It
I'll get off my soapbox.
no, I think you're totally right, and I mean, I think that, like you said, like it's not. There, this is obviously true, not just of the charismatic world or non-denominational world. But this being true, as in instances of abuse, are not like
Right.
it's not only pastors within this community that are abusing and deceiving individuals. Like obviously, the Catholic Church is a really good example of like they have very specific doctrines, very specific creeds, but when there is corruption,
True.
you know it, that those doctrines and then systems are only as good as the sort of structure in which they were built, and oftentimes those structures can be used to um, hide issues. So like I
That's
think
true.
that
That's true. Yeah.
I think that it isn't necessarily that like what is happening in the charismatic community is not found in other communities. But what I will say is that you're absolutely right to be like there's difference. Like there's a unique expression in the charismatic community that you don't see in other places, and like I think we are seeing also why it is worse in some cases because there is this lack of accountability. It's like it very much, I think, when I'm trying to like explain to individuals who grew up in not a Christian community at all, and they've only been exposed to sort of mainline Christianity, like in a lot of like academic circles that I run in,
Sure. Yeah.
having conversations about the dynamics at play between these different expressions of Christianity is like kind of hard. And the one analogy that I give is that you have this non-denominational charismatic world that's like the Wild West when it comes to religion, and just like the way that it even Azusa Street and the Pentecostal church, the way that it like popped up in general, like a lot of the like fruits of the spirit or gifts of the spirit were like emphasized, praying in tongues, and this sort of emphasizes, this is kind of like, you know, every man, woman, and child can have access to the divine, and so it removes sort of that authority structure. But what has happened is that you, like in the Wild West, you get people who become sort of lords of their land and they consolidate power, and they have these weird sort of agreements with each other. None of it's official, and all of it's like maybe even not even spoken, but just sort of known, where they all have dirt on each other. And it's just sort of like you have people kind of taking particular territories, and it isn't, if you're in Bethel, not everyone can come up to the front and talk about their what the Holy Spirit said to them. Like if it certainly at the International House of Prayer too, like it was like, they have this idea that we're non-denominational. We have this idea that like the Holy Spirit can speak to anyone, but in practicality, there are very specific doctrinal lines that if you cross those doctrinal lines, you're out, and there are very specific sort of like invisible boundaries of what you can and cannot do, the politics that you have, gender, like, are you a woman? Just flat out, that might not, if you have a dream and you're a woman, it's going to be different than if you're a man in that community. Like there's just different
Sure.
rules, and it's all totally unspoken, and it's very very Wild West. And then so like I saw this firsthand when I tried to contact these different pastors who I knew, who had like elevated my dad in the past and been like, "Hey, something bad's happening. My dad's continuing to prey on these communities, your communities. Um, this needs to stop." They were kind of like, "Well, what can we do? We don't have authority over him." And it was just that sort of like, I don't know, I'm not the sheriff of these parts, And it's like, so wait, is it my responsibility now? Like, is it me as his son? Do I have to like come forward and speak out against this because you guys won't? And turns out yeah, that's what had to happen.
That's really sad because you would think that if these people truly cared about people and truly wanted to, serve God, that they would be the first to say, "Oh, this is wrong." And
Yeah.
with Sean Bowles recently, Chris Valaton at Bethel, he basically these text messages have come out and he says exactly what you're saying. Like, yeah, we know that this is bad and shady, but he's not accountable to me. I have no authority over him. It's like, but you do have some level of authority because you've allowed him in your church. But and so they're not going to speak out against it, he says in these texts, because that might make everybody look bad. And it's like, dude, you need to call out if there's good and bad prophetic people, you need to call out the bad ones, and that's going to make the good ones look better. But at this point, I don't know if any of you guys are even remotely good. You mentioned Bethel and Bill Johnson, and one of the things we just did a couple episodes called "The Gospel According to Bill Johnson" about our local megachurch pastor John Lindell preaching a sermon on SOZO. And Bill Johnson will be here. Bill Johnson comes once or twice a year to James River, our local megachurch, and we've spent a lot of time talking about that megachurch and the issues with it on this podcast. So he preached a sermon on SOZO, and he doesn't mention really the ministry of SOZO or even really Bethel. He does casually talk about Bill Johnson as like a friend, but really he says it like 40 times in his sermon, and it's this idea of just introducing this word. And it's interesting because it was only like a couple weeks before Bill Johnson's supposed to be here. I can't prophesy. I don't know if this is like to set up for Bill's to help introduce, SOZO at our local church this time, but I would not be shocked at all if within the next year our local megachurch has a SOZO ministry really identical to Bethel. So the reason I called it the gospel according to Bill Johnson is it's a false gospel, in my opinion, and it's focused on this idea of that SOZO and healing and salvation, and it just mixes all these things together, and yet they charge like $120 to do these SOZO sessions and stuff. But I was really curious to ask you about your experience. I know SOZO was kind of introduced by Randy Clark, and so I'm not sure if it was really too much in the IHOP world. And I know that you guys, you and your dad, kind of have a little bit of connections to Bethel, and so was SOZO something that you saw? Was that anything that was kind of around you in the circles that you guys were running in, and kind of your thoughts on it and what you kind of know about it?
Yeah. So for sure, SOZO was, when I was growing up, it was less of a thing. And at the International House of Prayer, it was less of a thing. Now, SOZO isn't, you're totally right with Randy. I think that in sort of this iteration of even the term SOZO and all that sort of stuff, I think that originates from sort of the Toronto revival and Randy Clark and all that. But the idea behind SOZO is like not new, and it's not unique to Christianity. And in the, I need to do more reading and research about this, but there was a lot of new age sort of movements in the 50s and 60s, 70s that tapped in to some of these experiences, and like a lot of like psychedelic use and all that sort of stuff. But it is this sort of meditation that is supposed to bring about like trance-like states, this soaking in God's presence, and like there's many different iterations of like what this looks like, what is officially SOZO, what is soaking, what is all of these different things. But the fundamental, like, just to demystify it, it's a way of getting humans to become very vulnerable in an instance of like spiritual bliss. That's what's happened. If you looked at what's his name? The Jim Jones and the cult that he like Jonestown and the People's Temple, they used a lot of these same sort of techniques. A lot of like the New Age Christian and just like secular New Age cults use this sort of like kumbaya woo woo, like let's get together
Sure.
and feel all right sort of like thing. And it's not new. It's like it's totally, this is a very easy way to get human beings to unlock a sort of emotional vulnerability um, that opens them up. And it is 100% a cult technique. Like it is. I talked about. I just referenced Jim Jones and the People's Temple, and like those are not disconnected. Like the Toronto revival and
Okay.
the New Apostolic Reformation comes from the Latter Rain movement that birthed
Mhm.
Jim Jones and the People's Temple. Like it's all the same. Now the doctrine changes, but it's all from the same like movement in the 1950s and 60s that sparked this sort of like cult like Christian group with William Branham and these different figures. And so anyway, I say that from like a more removed sort of external perspective of like there is
Sure.
this
And I appreciate that.
yeah, but let me do the opposite and talk about my from a less like analytical or academic perspective and just talk about like what I saw with it.
Yeah,
And
please.
um I don't know if you tell me as far as like content warning because like what I'm about, if I was to share this story, it's like it's a
You can
really
share you can share whatever you want to share. I can put a warning if I need to at the beginning of it,
yeah.
after the fact. So just share whatever you feel you know want to share. So
Yeah, okay. So there are now multiple stories of different, and I'm gonna keep the abusers and the abused, like I'm gonna keep it a little bit general because not everybody has
sure.
wanted to share their story about this. But there's now a repeated pattern with a couple different abusers at least who have used this same process where they have led sozo um, or soaking type of spiritual like groups, either a small group or a one-on-one individual, but it's this sort of like very intimate, almost like council-like session where you have a spiritual leader in a shaman-like figure, like who's guiding a spiritual journey and spiritual experience, where they have the individual like meditate and perhaps even lay on the ground, listen to music, do whether there are prayers, speaking in tongues, there's different activities that can lead this. Um, there's now multiple stories of leaders leading someone in sozo, and typically a woman, sorry, a male pastor or prophet leading a woman in this sort of experience. And then when she's in like a vulnerable place, um, laying there, the uh, prophet will then assault her and like begin touching her
Mhm.
sexually and like removing her clothes. And what was this like supposed to be this very intimate spiritual moment becomes this intimate sexual moment, totally without their consent, totally coerced. And there's been, I will say, I know of three different instances where I know this explicitly happened, and then I know about half a dozen other instances where people have kind of referred to it. But like I have spoken to at least three different individuals who have all experienced this directly, and in reference to not all the same abuser. Like this wasn't just the one abuser who was doing this, and
Yeah.
they're big name abusers, and so for me, I cannot tell you how much I loathe and just am disgusted by the SOZO practice. And for me, the abuse and the sexual abuse is obviously extreme. That's not happening in every instance of this, but I think that it is very representative of what this process is. It's to force vulnerability and intimacy, and then usually for the purpose of exploitation. Does it always happen that way? No, but there's a reason why it's used by cult figures all across the world. It's because this is a known and proven activity that really forces sort of this very weird um, type of spiritual intimacy.
I've heard a lot of these stories as well as I've been kind of researching it because again, I'm not a prophet. I'm not saying that we absolutely will be seeing this in our local mega church.
Sure.
But the local mega church pastor John Lindell has basically become very, very good friends with Bill Johnson and is mimicking them. They just recorded a worship album and they're going to be releasing that here soon. So they're trying to enter into that realm where, Bethel does their worship. They're trying to do that. I mean, they're copying them so many different ways. And I think there's no reason to introduce this word sozo into the vocabulary of the church if you're not ultimately planning on bringing it there, the sozo ministries, because it's a Greek word, right? Sometimes it means salvation, sometimes it means healing. But we don't typically within the church just throw out Greek words for no reason. We're not typically teaching the congregation and laymen Greek words for fun. It's just, if you're going to be bringing up a Greek word, it's for very specific reasons. It might be like, oh, well, these Greek words mean this. And so that's why this passage is so interesting because these words mean those things. Okay, that's a good use of it. But why would you then introduce this so many times with the intent of it just being an interesting Greek word? There's an ulterior motive here. And so as I've been looking into this, because again, I think it's on its way here, it's amazing the fact that like occasionally you'll come across somebody who's like, yeah, I had such an amazing sozo experience. And that's possible. And if you're listening and you're like, I actually had a good experience, I'm not saying that it's not possible. In fact, it's kind of like intense therapy for the ones that have said it's positive. And there might be somebody with a good heart that's trying to do something, but the overwhelming stories that we've been hearing are just horrific. Absolutely horrific stories, whether it's physical abuse or there's been some stories of people being blackmailed by information that was revealed to them. So you're in this vulnerable moment and you're like, hey, this happened to me, and I'm struggling with this sin or whatever it might be. And then later on, it's like, hey, you remember you were struggling with that, and we can tell everybody. Like, it's just. These things are just so diabolical, really is the best word I can put out there. And so, and it's funny too, I wanted to say this more for the listeners, but maybe you could speak to this as well. But a lot of the things that we see in the more non-denominational charismatic movements, you mentioned that sozo kind of comes from the some of the new age and sort of secular kind of, kumbaya type world. And it's also used by cults. There's a lot of elements of some of the charismatic stuff is very new age. There's, the speaking in tongues, the snake handling. And I'm not saying that you guys were involved with that at IHOP. I don't know for sure, but it's just, you're still sort of adjacent to that realm within that world. And it's just interesting how much comes from the new age, and how there's somebody who did a video on YouTube where like they were showing basically these new age people speaking in tongues, and it's like it looks just like and sounds just like any charismatic church that might be doing these things. And it's like, what the heck? Like, and yet most of the charismatic churches would say don't do yoga because that's new age, right?
Right.
It's like, but you're doing all this other stuff that's obviously new age.
Yeah.
It's weird to me.
Yeah, and
so
And I think the conversation around it has been understandable, but like not helpful in the criticism of these movements because like I remember growing up and I one of the earliest sort of like memories of what I felt like I had to defend my community from like my sort of apologetics. It wasn't from like atheists or it wasn't from, you know, people who were Buddhist or Hindu or something like it wasn't. It was of other Christians. You know, like our community was always in conflict with other Christians. That was the sort of tension, and one of the big criticisms of the community that I was raised in was this like it's new agey. It's sort of mystical or it's tapping into like Eastern religion and traditions and like crystals and vibes and energy and and that was fair. It was true. Like that is
Sure.
true. Like that
Yeah.
and like my dad was I remember there was a time where after Bob Jones died and this is when I was older. I was in my 20s here so like um I was more um, aware of the context and the conversation at this point.
Sure.
But Bob Jones passed away, and my dad said that Bob Jones started visiting him in the night, and I remember someone was critiquing my dad and like really raising alarms because they were like Bob Hartley is saying that he's speaking with the dead, and that's like a psychic medium, you know, culty thing.
Yeah.
And it's true. Like, yeah, that is the red flag. But what happens too often is we get it the root of the problem isn't in the like at least in my opinion, isn't like the deviation from the like true gospel. It's the way in which these practices are abusive and lead
Sure.
to corruption. And like it, for me, it has to be like grounded back in the reality of like human experience. So like, I don't care if like your Christian aunt has like a few crystals and that she rubs and like believes that God is like, you know, healing people through those crystals like that's one thing, you know, but when it's like the pastor of the community is like this we are going to be using and imbuing these particular crystals and you can get them for subscriptions of 299 every month, you know, like and selling that to like exploit the people. It's what Russell Brand is doing right now.
Mhm.
He's like, oh, I'm a Christian now and here have this amulet, and it's like, dude, what the hell? Like it's just clear exploitation of the people, or like you said with the like you have this weird group where like people are saying you shouldn't even do yoga and yet they're doing some of this stuff. The thing that I think of is like it was so purity culture was so impressed upon me every day of my life for all of my upbringing, like and the
That's not just a charismatic thing.
no, of
That
course
was
not.
just
That's just
mainstream.
evangelical,
Yeah.
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 No, but like so true in the charismatic communities too. And there's this idea like if you have sex with someone before you get married, you're creating this sort of soul tie. And it's this sort of the perspective was always, or at least one of the reasons that you want to save yourself for marriage and, you know, keep pure is to keep from having these like deep vulnerable experiences with someone that you shouldn't share. And like when it came to sexuality, people understood that, but like then when it comes to spiritual and an emotional sort of vulnerability and intimacy, it's all it's it's the free love in 1970s in this, where like people can come up to you and be like, God just told me. Like I had so many different individuals come up to me and lay hands on me. I don't know this woman. I don't know. She doesn't know anything about me. She knows who my dad is, and she feels like she can talk specifically about my identity and the thing that the Lord told her about me. And it's like, I did not consent to this. This is like too intimate, too intense, not something that I want. I don't want to be a part of. It's like violating sort of my autonomy to be forced into this sort of like prayer spiritual experience. And like I don't mean to like blur the lines to like insinuate that that's like similar to sexual assault, but I'm trying to make the metaphor too of just like this lack of care and concern with
Sure.
spiritual intimacy, and this hyper infatuation with any type of spiritual high. And this is totally Bethel's MO, is like just any spiritual high that they can get their hands on, whether it's true or not. And that's why, like, someone like my dad who comes in and is not even really hiding the fact that he is 100% making this shit up and is not truly prophesying the truth. They're like, yeah, give us, give me 15 more of those. Like I love it. Here, come to this conference and that conference and this conference, because it's just like, it's not about the substance. It's just about the high and the spiritual high, because that
Sure.
makes money and gives power. And, and you have a community of people who should be more wise to it. But, just because of all the conventions and the way the leadership has been structured,
Yeah.
it's not called out.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You mentioned the purity culture, and yet a lot of the ones speaking about it and kind of harsh and really shaming a lot of people with that are also the same ones who it's coming out that they are abusers,
Right.
And sexual abusers too. And it's like, dude, you're shaming like teenagers who let their hormones get a little bit out of control or whatever, right? You're shaming them as though they've just committed like this just awful sin, instead of being like, hey, there's grace, there's forgiveness, whatever. And yet you're going around not just abusing people, but grooming for abuse, or manipulating situations like these SOZO sessions where they get people extremely vulnerable. And again, it's this idea where, they'll tell people like, high school, college age boys should not be alone with high school, college age girls, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're very strict about those things. They're very strict. And yet you'll have a male pastor, elder, prophet, apostle, whatever title they want to give themselves, doing SOZO sessions,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes alone with a woman.
Yeah.
And it's like, I have some issues with Billy Graham or whatever, but he allegedly have this, it's called the Billy Graham rule, where he wouldn't ever be alone with a woman because he
Right.
didn't want there to even be the appearance of evil. And it's like, I can respect that. And a pastor is like, I don't want to be in that situation, or I don't want, I don't even want this situation to potentially look like I did anything wrong, and there's a level of like, at least you're practicing what you preach, and I don't know, maybe there's stories about him, I don't know, but
Yeah.
there's other issues with that. But the point being is that at least it was sort of practicing what he preached in a way. Whereas, some of these SOZO people, they're literally saying to these people, oh, don't be alone. And maybe that's wise to say that. And then they go ahead and do the SOZO session alone with a woman. And it's because, I mean, I can only think of nefarious reasons that they're doing that. I don't know. Maybe, yeah, I can't think of any good reason why they're doing that.
I'll go one farther. Yeah. I can't think of a whole
right.
lot of good reasons why doing a SOZO session in general. Like if you're wanting, you're wanting healing, there's processes of healing like that. You like can't like there's conventional ways to go about these things,
right.
to bring about the good, and it takes work and it takes time. Like if you need someone to like lay on the ground and meditate while listening to music to experience a certain supernatural experience, like, I mean, I can't for the life of me. I know I agree with what you're saying. Like this, what you said earlier of like, there definitely are going to be people who are like, oh, I really appreciated it and enjoyed it. And like, so I don't want to universalize because um, not every single one of these sessions leads to like horrific exploitation. But
Sure.
fundamentally, just as a premise, I'm just like, it just isn't, I can't, I cannot even begin to
Yeah.
see the value in something like this on at least like a sort of like corporate religious level like 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 why if you have a lot of times it's done by people you don't even know and it's like I don't know, like if you and your wife
Right.
want to like lay together and like have this sort of like very intimate moment, that's one thing, but like it's just it's just so it's so intimate, so spiritually vulnerable.
I like that you said it takes work, and even if you had a positive experience in a sozo
Yeah.
session, one of the negatives on top of all of the other ones that we've heard is the lack of aftercare, right?
Yeah.
So you're going through this extremely emotional, vulnerable situation, and for some people, it's traumatic in and of itself. And you may be dealing with childhood trauma or sexual
Yeah.
trauma of other things. And then even if the guy doing it doesn't actually abuse you, you still went through all of that. And they're only like 1 to 2 sessions sometimes,
Mm.
at max, maybe 3 sessions at the most. Sometimes it's just one. And it's like that you may uncover a ton of things, and then now there's no aftercare because that's not the point of it. The point of it is just to have this radical moment of spiritualization, and then it's like, oh wow, I just uncovered a lot of stuff, and now I need to process this, and there's no help for that.
Yeah.
And so, like when my dad passed away in 2021, I went to a secular counselor
Mm.
because I me and my dad were super close,
Yeah.
and I miss him a lot. He was my buddy, right?
Yeah.
And I needed to talk to somebody,
Right.
but I didn't want it to be this over spiritualization of like, oh, he's in heaven. It's like I already believe that. I don't need somebody to tell me that over and over again. I don't need somebody to tell me that it's like I want to process what I'm actually feeling. Like I'm sad right now. I miss him. I want to sit and have a cigar with him again, drink scotch and talk theology, right? Like I want to talk that out. And so I love counseling. I think I advocate it. I think it's a great thing. And if you're a Christian, it's like, it's okay to go to a secular counselor, and there are some good Christian counselors out there. I don't want to say that they're
Right.
not. There
Yeah.
definitely are. But they're trained, they're professional. They know how to handle these things. And
Yeah.
it's not this like, we didn't have these intense sessions where we were like, speaking in tongues and everything. It's like, no, he's just like, tell me how you're feeling. And, I just kind of dump what I'm feeling. And then we process that, right?
Yeah.
And it's super healthy and really good. And so I recommend that
Yeah.
if you're dealing with trauma, not SOZO, based on what I understand about it. I've never been through a SOZO session. One of the churches we were going to for a while started to kind of do some deliverance stuff. And it's a little different than SOZO, but kind of in the similar vein. And I was really only in like 1 or 2 of those as like a helper person, but it was always men to men or women to women. They were pretty clear about that. But it got weird sometimes, and I didn't feel super comfortable in those situations as like one of the men in the room. And
Yeah.
I never really said anything. I was just kind of like there to be there in case, God revealed something to me or whatever. I don't know. It never happened. So I was just kind of just there as another guy and praying and stuff, whatever. But it was weird, and I didn't feel very comfortable with it. And I'm not sure that it was actually helpful in the long run
Yeah.
for the guys that I personally saw go through this. Whereas I think counseling probably would have been a way better situation for them.
No,
So-
totally.
Yeah.
Well, and I think
Now,
oh, go,
go
sorry.
ahead. No, go ahead.
I think that this is one of the like fundamental issues with not just SOZO, but the especially Bethel, but the charismatic world in general, is that like, think about prophecy. My dad he would get information that he got from people who um, know these individuals. And they would be like, like if someone came to you after your dad had just passed away and a prophet comes and tells you, like, I heard from the Lord that your father's proud of you or something like that. Like it might
Sure.
be a very like deep emotional experience in the moment, but it will be this sort of like hollow, shallow thing that doesn't actually help you deal with the grief. It doesn't help you deal with the reality that like my father is not in my life anymore, and
Right.
and it trivializes people's pain and trivializes a lot of like what we're experiencing. And like faith healing is like that too. Is like, you might have a disease and like it's lovely, and I love the idea of being able to like go to a pastor and then he lays hands on you and then suddenly you can see again. Like that'd be lovely if that worked, but it doesn't a lot of times. And a lot of times when people have illnesses, it's lifelong things. Like I have an autoimmune condition, and I would love to be able to like go to a pastor and he just like heals me of it. But no, I'm probably gonna have to change my diet. I'm gonna have to change my exercise. I'm gonna like
Sure.
my entire life is gonna be about um trying to contend with reality, and
Yeah.
having someone get up and tell me that you don't have to contend with reality, that there's supernaturality, like there's this whole other world. And it's like, it would be great if it was true. And even if it was true, like, that's just not the world that we live in. Even if you could get healed 1 out of every 10 times, like most people, like when they have cancer, you're going to have to go through chemo. You're going to have to do these different things. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't still pray and all these different things, but it's just like, it's this quick fix spirituality that's like, God is going to intervene in the moment. And if you have faith, it's going to happen. And then it doesn't happen. And people are left jilted. And another way that you see it, like, we are being robbed of healthcare workers. Like, there are all of these different individuals who really want to bring about healing and want to do good. Like, that feeling of like, I want to care for someone who's in need. And they go to Bethel and they go to these prophetic conferences and they're like, I'm not going to go to medical school. I'm going to learn how to pray over people, and I'm going to go to these different things. You see this, like, I can't remember what her name is now, but there was this woman who went to overseas and like started her own clinic, and she didn't have any experience, right? Like they were like giving out some vaccines, but largely it was like faith-based, and it wasn't rooted in science, and it wasn't rooted in like discipline. Like you can just spend 4 years to 8 years learning the medical field and bring a lot of good to people, or you can spend a 2-month, Bethel or YWAM intensive and then go and just pray for a bunch of people. And like
Right.
it gives the sort of shortcut to doing the good that you want to do. And I think that there's a lot of people who are getting wrapped up in these worlds, genuinely good people wanting to bring about good, who are being told these like absolutely ridiculous lies about the nature of reality. And it's causing them to like spend the first 5-10 years of their adult lives pursuing false gold, quite literally false gold, if you know Bethel's story.
Well, it comes out of the
The vents.
ventilation
Yeah,
system.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. That's yeah. Well, that reminds me of like the old story of like the guy on the island, and he's like praying.
Yeah.
He's like, God's gonna save me, and the boat comes by, and they're like, hey, jump in the boat, and he's like, no, God's gonna save me.
Yeah.
And then he ends up drowning, and he's like, God, why didn't you save me? He's like, I sent you a boat, I sent you a helicopter,
Right.
I sent you all these different things. And it's like, I mean, you're right. Like, sometimes modern medicine is a grace of God that he has
Totally.
given people skills and knowledge to pursue these things and to help people. And so like, I think sometimes we try to over spiritualize the world, and this is coming from, I'm not exactly a full on cessationist. I do believe that God is capable and powerful enough to do miraculous things today, but I'm also a rationalist, I guess, in a way. And like, and I think that God operates often through normal physical means and laws of nature sort of situation, right? And so like, like I don't necessarily think that hurricanes are a judgment. It's the weather patterns that exist in the world, and so they come by. You know what I mean? And so like, if you do certain behaviors, you eat terrible, do these things, there are consequences to those things.
Yeah,
right? It doesn't
totally.
mean that God's cursing you. It's like, dude, you only ate McDonald's every day of your life. It doesn't mean God doesn't love you, but there are consequences to eating McDonald's every day of your life, right? And then there's benefits to doing healthy things, right? And so, anyways, yeah, I agree with you. Like, I think sometimes we forget that God actually operates and in the physical world in natural means. And so you want to help people get better. Well, one way you could do that is to go into medical care, or become a nurse, or become a doctor, or become even homeopathic stuff sometimes is at least more rooted in like ancient medicines and stuff. Like there's more there's probably more benefits to that than just saying, hey, I'm going to pray for you. And hopefully there's going to be this miraculous thing that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Does that mean that do I actually believe that God never, ever heals? I mean, I've heard some credible stories of people who say that God has healed them. And I can't explain those things. And so like, if good things happen like that, then sure. I'm not going to like diminish that. Like if somebody's got a credible story, but oftentimes, and I'll say this too, those stories don't come from Bethel and IHOP and places like that. They come from like genuine places where people are, just, in other words, it's not from the ones where it's not the abusers doing like one good miracle over here. It's typically people who are just kind of, it's a mom praying for their child. It's a friend praying for another friend. Like it's very organic type things where you see those things. And so, but again, I can't necessarily explain it, and I just trust that, hey, if anything good happens, I'm gonna be like, cool, I'll take your word for it.
Well, and there isn't like, it's not even unscientific to say that the believing in healing and like within your own body, like there's the placebo effect, and like it's not like the body has some weird capability to heal itself, whether that's like God or whatever. But genuinely, like there's a lot of like, especially like with chronic conditions and stuff like that. Like sometimes I wish that I believed in healing, because I'm like, again, I got this like autoimmune condition, and it's like, if I really, really believed it, maybe my body would heal itself, but I don't believe it. So I'm not going to get I can't like force the placebo effect to happen. But there's this sense in like, I really think that like believing in the magical world is totally fine. And like, I'm not trying to come against that. In fact, I think people should be able to believe in the magical world, believe in prayer, believe in these things, and not be taken advantage for that. That's where my perspective is.
So I do kind of want to maybe switch conversation slightly over to the topic of prophecy. We've kind of hit on that a little bit. We talked about your dad and Sean Bowles both kind of utilizing this sort of method of data mining, prophetic words, things like that. But so you were on a podcast with John Collins. I can't remember the name of the podcast. Is it the William Branham podcast?
The William Branham Historical Research Podcast.
Yes,
and it's a very,
that's what it is.
He has like a lot of different sub sort of threads. And
gotcha. So there was one that I listened to with you, and I think it was called the Tangled Web I think was what it was called, or Untangling
Oh,
the
right.
New Apostolic Reformation. Anyways, I'll share the links for anybody who's interested of listening to it on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/badfruitpodcast. But anyways, so you were talking with John Collins on there, and you gave this idea of I think you called it a shadow prophecy, and I really liked it. I thought it was a really interesting concept, and so I don't know if you remember it
Yeah.
much, but if you want to talk a little bit about that, because I thought that was really interesting when we think about this idea of like, how do these prophecies kind of go out there, and why do people latch on to them?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because like the nature of prophecy has definitely changed in the last like 20 to 30 years based off of like technology. There a lot of times prophecy, and it still is today, but like happens behind closed doors without like recordings, and now there's recordings, so the tactics of giving prophecies have had to change. And when I'm talking about this type of prophecy, like for those who are not familiar and haven't really seen a lot of like the prophetic world, there are multiple types of prophecy. And you have the individuals who would give the very specific words, like my father, who would give the like, um, there's a John in this church, and he is lives on 7721 Mulberry Lane or whatever, and this is the word that I got from him.
That's me. That's me. That's me.
Right, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, my dad has a church directory that has it written John 7712 Mulberry Lane. And then, a specific prophecy about John and his life. So that's like the one type of prophecy, and that's the more magic show. That's the magician sort of like, aha, and I'm going to call someone from the crowd, and it's very performative. There is the larger prophecies that are about something that is going to happen in the future, either for like a church or a movement or a nation. These are like the Dune prophecies. This is what people think of when they think of like the good old grand Old Testament prophecies of like, there will be a shaking of the earth, and then up from the seas shall arise three beasts, and this beast will represent this, and that sort of stuff. And
Yeah.
so I became very familiar with the sort of ways in which those prophecies were cast. My dad would do this too, but also just everybody within my community. Like, I saw a lot of these types of large scale grand prophets. And for instance, there was a prophecy that was circling in the International House of Prayer and some of the Bethel community in 2010. And it was a prophecy spoken primarily. Mike Bickle was the one who like shared it, but there was what's his name? Bennett. I can't remember actually his first name right now, but I think Steve Bennett, or I can't remember. But he was this sort of like behind the scenes grand prophet, or at least he pretended to be. And so he has this huge vision about 2015. And he says he has all of these specifics that he gives about how there are going to be solar flares that like knock off the satellites, and that the internet is going to go down for 10 days, and that there is going to be wars, and all of these different very specific things. But one, just keeping it specific, like one thing he talked about was the solar flares that knocked out satellites, and it was stated very explicitly. But see, what happened is that he tells this sort of story behind the scenes, right? And he tells it to some of the leaders. He doesn't give this prophecy up on the stage. And then, so he kind of like casts this first vision of the prophecy. And then Mike Bickle reiterates the vision of this prophecy and he gives it to a larger audience. But when Mike Bickle then retells it, it's a little more vague and it's not as like defined and it's not as clear, right? And then the more and more people talk about that prophecy that happens in 2010, the details of it get fuzzy. And this is the idea of the prophetic shadow, is that you have a prophecy that is given that is like casting a light on a particular object, but the object itself disappears, and what is remembered is the shadow that it casted. Like that is what stays permanent. And that's what stays in people's minds, just naturally. Like that's just kind of how memory works too. Is through time things become fuzzier, they become less clear. The lines that delineate it become blurry, and it becomes much more like the shadow of something, the outline of something, rather than the thing itself. And then by the time 2015 arrives, if the shadow has been pushed large enough, you can really place any object in there and say that that's what was said. And this is exactly what attempted to happen, is that 2015 rolls around and there isn't solar flares that knock out. Like there is no internet, there is no world war or anything like this. But instead it becomes this general like, oh, it was prophesied that there was going to be a shaking. And then I'm sure that in a lot of communities it was used, like 2015 was when Donald Trump kind of came into for the forefront, and
announces presidency
or announces his president. Yeah, exactly. And like in evangelical charismatic communities, like of course that was a big deal. And so and of course the prophecy has nothing to do with Donald Trump, like zero
Right.
things to do with it. But yet this sort of recasting of the vision back using this larger shadow, it now feels like prophetic fulfillment. And this is the entire history at the International House of Prayer, at Bethel. Like I have seen people do this over and over and over and over again, where they say the fulfillment of prophecy is just total deception. It's just it never happened the way that it was supposed to. Another good example of this is Bob Jones gave a big prophecy about revival coming to Kansas City when the Chiefs win the Super Bowl. I don't know if you've ever heard of this one, but this was like a big thing.
Yeah.
And I am and was always like a huge Chiefs fan. And people don't necessarily know this, but the Chiefs used to suck for most
Right.
of my
Well,
upbringing.
we're in Chiefs Kingdom here in Springfield.
Oh, right,
so.
right, great, yeah.
Yeah. So we know all about that.
Right. And yeah, before the Patrick Mahomes and the Andy Reid days, it was the dark days in Kansas City. And so the idea that like we would even win a playoff game was so foreign. And so Bob Jones gives this vision in like the 1980s, and for like 40 years nothing happens. And then when the Chiefs do win the Super Bowl, like the prophecy was extremely specific, that like there was going to be a marching of like the people that started at the International House of Prayer, and they were going to walk all the way to Arrowhead Stadium, and they were going to fill the stadium, and it was going to be the sign of a revival, and that the whole stadium was going to fill with people who were giving their lives to the Lord, and there was going to be healings and all these sort of things. Well, the Chiefs win the Super Bowl in 2019, and immediately COVID happens. And like for the next year, no one's in stadiums. Like 2020 was like the only year in national football history where stadiums were like very infamously not full of anyone, regardless of any of that. And so but then just
It's almost like God's got a sense of humor in that sense.
yeah,
I don't know.
I don't think God.
You know what?
I
No,
firmly
I'm
believe
joking.
that God
I'm joking.
doesn't care about the Kansas City Chiefs, but if he does,
Sure.
he's got a
sure,
sense of
yeah.
humor about it for sure.
Yeah.
And but despite being so wrong, despite just missing it, it is still something that people are testifying as some. I don't really even know how it's done, but people, again, that sort of like the shadow was casted, and it's like all that matters is the Chiefs won the Super Bowl. And like that is the fulfillment of the prophecy. And it's like, well,
But that wasn't even the prophecy.
that wasn't the prophecy. It was like
Yeah.
this was going to be a sign of something else, because like Chiefs winning the Super Bowl is like, well, they better eventually, like,
Sure.
within the next, like, it took them 40 years to do it,
Was that guy's name Terry Bennett?
Terry
Is that who you're
Bennett.
talking
That's
about?
who. Yes, that's
Okay.
it. Yeah, Terry Bennett.
You're absolutely right with the whole. That's why I love that idea of the shadow, and it's like the shadow's cast, but now all we ever see is that, and it's like it's almost like a game of telephone in a way too. Like that might be another appropriate metaphor is like, we're all in the circle and I'm whispering, banana, and it comes back around and somebody says parrot, and it's like, how did you get parrot out of banana?
Yeah.
And like sometimes it's like it's moved so far from what it was originally there. And then sometimes it's even worse than that, because in some ways you could almost say that is just a genuine misunderstanding and a game of telephone, where it's like, oh, if you tell me a prophecy and so like sometimes you could just say, well, that's just miscommunication maybe.
Sure.
But it's not always that way. But other times it's retroactively gaslighting everybody.
Right.
And so a perfect example of this is so our local megachurch, James River, the main pastor's two sons, they're adults. They are kind of in line to be the next co-pastors of the church when John moves on to write books or whatever he's going to do. He's not even that old, but he's kind of stepping down as head pastor, and then his sons are going to take over. And so one of his sons, David Lindell, preached a sermon last year in around October of 2023. October of 2023, he preached the sermon, and he said that by this time next year, all of the couples who have been told medically they cannot have a baby will be holding the baby. And he said, this is not just for those who are here tonight, but this is for everyone who's watching online at all of our multiple campuses, because they've got several campuses. And he says that the Lord told him, and he says it like twice, the Lord told me this is for all of you. So that means that 1 year from there, you're supposed to be holding the baby. 9 months means that people should be conceiving within a few months. And I was honestly willing to give him the benefit of the doubt of people just being pregnant by October of the following year, like, but he gave that prophecy. And I just remember thinking, like, this is not going to end well for people. Yeah. Like, this is a terrible thing to say, because I know people who have struggled with these issues, who've been told they can't have children, or that it's going to be very difficult. Like, that is a very heartbreaking place to be. And it is, amazing when they finally do get to have a child in certain circumstances through therapy and different things, whatever. But it doesn't always happen. And, it's a very emotional thing, right? For couples who want to have children and can't. And so for him to give this hope to people is so sad to me. Yeah. And so then October of 2024 came around, and multiple people, I know of at least 6 people who have messaged me or talked to me, who have said that they were unable to, they're still unable to have a child.
Yeah.
So anyways, they have basically tried to be like, well, so his dad preached a sermon at the end of last year, and he basically says, I'd rather have somebody who's trying to prophesy than somebody who despises prophecy. And it's okay to get prophecy wrong sometimes because, you're trying. And so we're not always going to get it right. And so he totally gaslights us. Like, allegedly, the Lord told him that all of these people, and he said every single one of them. And he, all this, like, it was very specific.
Yeah.
And now it's, well, he was trying. And, we can't get it right all the time. And he didn't specifically state that his son did this or anything like that. But it was very clear that that's what it was about.
Yeah.
And so literally he's just gaslighting everybody into this idea of, well, he's just trying. So I want to ask you about, because we've mentioned Bill Johnson and Bethel, and we mentioned your dad, Bob. So I've heard this from a few different sources. I've actually, you mentioned it either in a tweet or in a podcast I was listening to. I can't remember. But that your dad gave a prophecy to Bill Johnson.
Yeah.
I'd kind of like to hear about that. Were you there at the time? Do you just know about it? What's this all about? What was the prophecy?
Yeah. Well, so my dad has given Bill Johnson a bunch of prophecies, and since 2009, 10, my dad was like one of the more prominent prophetic voices in certainly Bill's life, and just in behind the scenes at Bethel in general. But in the summer of 2023, I was in a very unique place with my dad where I have long since, in my early 20s, I was traveling with my dad, and I wrote a book about him that was at the time, it's a very complicated book because, like, when I started writing it, I viewed my father in very rosy glasses, and then by the end of the time that I wrote the book, which was only like the course of a year, I had become very disillusioned towards my father and his stories. And so
Sure.
it was very complicated, but we had a publishing contract and stuff, and so I finished the book, but it was a very weird book. But the book is called "I Hope It's Not Hereditary" too, which, like, at the time was a joke. It's a whole thing. But anyway,
Sure.
so I had traveled with my dad back then. I had met Bill, and I'd seen some of the prophecies back then. And this was in 2012, 2013 ish. So a decade later, I am now grown, and I have what's the Paul line? When I was a child, I spoke as a child, but now I've put away childish things.
Yeah.
Like, I had recognized that my father, long recognized that my father was had become really disillusioned towards his whole thing. But he's still my dad, and like, my parents had separated during that time, and my dad had become pretty estranged from most of the family, and so I still had this sort of relationship with my dad. Again, this is summer of 2023, and so I fly out to Kansas City to spend a few weeks with my dad and to help him. He calls me. He says that he has a lot of health issues and that he could really use my help, and all this sort of stuff. So, long story, the whole story is absolutely wild, but we end up flying to Reading, and I go with him to Reading. And my dad is fairly wealthy and has several different houses that he owns. And so he owns a couple properties in Reading, and he'll stay out there. So we go and we're visiting those properties. But during that time, he's like, I really want to meet with Bill, and I want to meet with the leadership team at Bethel. And I was just like, I was kind of confused because under my impression, I was like, I didn't even know that he was still ministering with Bethel, because I knew that Chris Valentin there had been sort of a fallout, that they had been aware that, like, my dad was had fabricated some prophecies. I didn't know how much they knew, how little they knew. Also, after my dad had and my mom and dad had separated. My dad was like actively dating around, and this was what I believed at the time, and was like in relationships with like several different women, and that is not something that purity culture you're allowed to do.
No.
So I didn't, but I, again, it was just my dad. And I was like, okay, I'm going to try to divorce myself from this world that you live in. And I'm going to try to just be a good son, and I'm going to go with you, and I'm going to try to give you good advice. And during the thing, I was giving him advice. I'm like, Dad, you just can't do this. Like, you can't, you know,
Sure.
for all these different reasons. And anyway, we go to we're Reading, and we're at Bethel, and like we drive up, and there's a cone that has Bob Hartley's name on it, and there's like a parking spot, and we come in, and we are treated like absolute celebrities. And it's like, and my dad was just like glowing, like he was the king who walked home to his kingdom. Like, it was just this sort of, people had this like holy reverence from him. And it's been 5-6 years since I've experienced this before. Like, I used to experience this when we were traveling around with him, but I'm just being like kind of reawakened to the world that I grew up in, but seeing it from a much more like adult perspective, and being like, holy shit, this is just crazy. Like, this is ridiculous. And we're in a staff meeting where people are falling out of their chairs in the prayer. And I don't mean to like mock or make fun of these. Like, I get like, it's just wild experiences, and I understand that people like have these weird.
So are you saying like those like slain in the spirit type situation?
Yeah. So this is so
kind of thing.
Yeah,
Okay.
and like just I don't know how familiar you are with this, but like the people, there's the like rocking and making noises, and then like someone breaks out in laughter, and then it's hallelujah. I don't want to like replicate it, because I don't want to like mock it, and it also
Sure.
still gives me the creeps a little bit. So, but like
Right,
people pray,
yeah.
and so I'm just like kind of in the belly of the beast for experiencing, seeing these stuff, and I'm just like, this is wild. But yeah, just trying to be supportive and everything. Like, I don't believe in this, but these people do, and I want to respect that and everything. And then
Sure.
we, the next day, have this meeting set up with Bill, and my dad is dealing with, I've spoken about this openly, but my dad has been dealing with alcohol abuse issues for quite some time, and like addiction to pain. He has like a lot of different injuries, and he's been on pain medication, and he's then started abusing pain medication. So just like different addiction issues, and it really is causing horrible health issues in his life. And so he had kind of vowed to me that he was going to work to fix that, and so he wanted to meet with Bill, and he wanted me to come with him to be like, look, I'm working on rebuilding my relationship with my family. I'm working on gonna do these things for my health and these addictions. Like, that was the reason that my dad told me that we were meeting with Bill Johnson. On the way, my dad pulls out a whiskey bottle, and like while we're driving, drinks like a quarter of like a little liter, or like a flask sort of thing, like I don't know, those flask bottles.
Yeah.
And he just like takes like the equivalent of like 2 doubles or something like that, and just like downs it. And we're driving, and I'm like, what the hell, and force him to pull over, and I start driving. So we get there, and so like, so he's already this, and I'm like, I don't know what to do at this point. I'm like, do I just? It just felt like I almost felt like he did it symbolically to me, because it was like we were there to talk about your addiction, and I think that he kind of flaunted his fact that like, I'm not this, you're not in control, I'm in control. I don't know, but like he drinks this whiskey. We go into this meeting. And Bill's wife had passed away like the year previous in 22. And Bill had started dating another woman. And I don't know much details about this new woman. I know that she was younger and that they had started dating very shortly after his first wife had passed away. And the night before we meet with Bill, my dad gets an email about. I don't really know what was in the email. There's a lot of other people who have talked about this email because it was sent out to a lot of the Bethel community. But there's this email where Bill is basically kind of like informing the community that he is in this relationship with this woman, and like kind of laying down the law of like sort of like, hey, stay out of my business. People, I think that there was questions about like, hey, you're dating her really close after your wife died,
Yeah.
and like she's young, and so they just question, and he was just kind of being like, this is what's happening. Get on board. I'm sure he framed it in not as explicit of terms, but there's this sort of announcement email that's sent out. And my dad reads it, and then my dad comes into this meeting, and instead of telling him how he's reconciling with his family or attempting to reconcile with his family, instead of my dad being like, hey, this is what I'm going to do about the addiction issues that I have, he proceeds to, for an hour and a half, talk about how he had gotten a prophetic word from God giving Bill Johnson permission to date this woman. And I am absolutely shell shocked the whole time. It was like the last time I was like truly, truly shocked by something my father did in person. Like I was just like, I didn't say much during the whole time. I was just like, what is going on? Because I was embarrassed for my dad because I was like, Bill is going to see through this. Like he just sent the email out yesterday. This is so on the nose. And in it, my dad was telling Bill how, he had also given Bob Jones permission after Bob Jones' first wife, Viola, died, that he could marry Bonnie Jones. And so my dad was kind of like coming from this sort of historical prophetic standpoint of like, I am the prophet who has given permission in the past for other men to marry, and I am giving you this permission. And it was such a weird conversation. And I fully expected Bill to like kick us out of the office and be like, don't come back here again. I can smell the whiskey on your breath, like just like, um, and
Sure.
I was like, what do I do in this situation? Instead, Bill is like super thankful. He says it, and he tells my dad that there are two individuals who have most shaped the prophetic history of Bethel. And he told him to his face, "This is just me, my dad, and Bill talking." And he says that you, speaking of my dad, the two Bobs, Bob Hartley and Bob Jones, are the two prophetic voices that have been the most significant in Bethel's history. And he like thanks him for what he's doing, thanks him for his word, and is like, I receive that. I receive everything that you're saying. Um, and it was shot like I still am like flabbergasted by that whole
Yeah.
interaction because it was just like it was the first instance where I was like, oh, Bill Johnson's not naive. Like I used to think of him as very naive, as like a person who is just like really believed this in this magical world and like believed what he was selling to, and there were people like my dad who were taking advantage of him, who like came in and were gonna like take advantage of his faith and his naivety. And it just became very clear, like, nope, this isn't about prophecy. This is about power, and this is about permission, and this is about, sh- you know, sort of like in church politics. And my dad is coming in, wielding his power, being like, "Hey, like, will you cash this check of mine? Like, I am gonna say." you know, I will validate this thing that you're doing, but you have to validate me and my prophetic voice. Again, like that was what was happening. My dad felt alienated from a community that he was once very a part of, and he was trying to use prophecy to buy his way back in to it. And he was successful doing it.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, so
Sure.
you can tell me that I'm off base here, but I mean it sounds as though he wanted you to be there as a prop,
Yeah.
potentially, to be like, here's my son who I'm we get along now, and it's okay. And then, like you were saying just now, like, hey, I will trade you publicly this permission to date these younger women, and you need to back me up in my my thing. And I mean, am I, like, you're kind of saying that, but like, I guess where it comes down to is like, if that's true, if that's an accurate analysis of it, which I mean, based on what you're saying, that's my analysis of it. I mean, I feel like this just shatters any possibility that this world of Bethel and IHOP are even remotely true in any capacity. Because I feel like at that point it comes down to, hey, I'm going to scratch your back, you scratch mine, and you're going to get to date the younger women, and I'm going to get to continue in my addiction to alcohol and painkillers and being a respectable person within the prophetic community or something. I don't know. It just seems so shady and nefarious to me.
No, totally.
Just listening to it.
And I think that this is when people talk about like the behind the doors deals and stuff like that. I don't think that it's ever stated out loud as explicitly. Although sometimes it is, and I have another little story about that. But I think it's like this. It's just this, like, for anybody who is even the remote foggiest aware of like social dynamics, that is exactly what happened. Like there was no instance, like it was very clear that I was being used as a prop, like you said. Like my dad was like, here, I have my son. See, this is good. Like I am sort of trying to reconcile, and like I'm not as much of a wild card anymore. And then here's what I have to offer to you. And Bill was not like naive to it. Was not like, oh my God, I can't believe it. Or tell me more. Like how did God show up to you? Like, what did you see? Tell me more about this vision. He was just like, cool, great. There was that sort of exchange. And then this is compounded by the fact that not 6 months later, it comes out that my dad is abusing people, and like he wasn't just dating around, he was actually like preying upon people. And then I call up Bill and I'm like, hey, we just met. Like I just had this conversation with you.
Yeah.
Like, you know where I'm coming from. You know that I was just here trying to help my dad. And I felt like I had the authority to do that because I had been used by my father as a sort of political piece in that thing, where he had used me to like testify that he was getting back on the straight and narrow. And so I was like, hey, you kind of invited me into this world. So therefore, like, now it's sort of on my shoulders and responsibility to like do something about this. And so then I contact Bill and send him an email, and I'm like, hey, my dad is having home groups in the Reading community where he's inviting people, where he's having them come in, and then he's preying upon the women. Like, this is explicit. This is, and he's doing prophetic deception and all of these different stuff. And I was very, very clear about it. And Bill read my email and he responded, and he was kind of covered his tail. He responded sort of like a very political response, and it sounded like he was going to take it seriously. But then literally that same week, so I think it was a Wednesday that I get a hold of Bill and I send him this email of like, hey, my dad is an actual predator and he's preying on your community. And he's like, not well. He's, like he's self-destructive. He's on medication. He's like, it's just a mess. And Bill's like, okay, I'll do something about it. And then that Sunday, there's a prophetic conference, or that weekend, there's a prophetic conference at Bethel. And Bill saves a seat. Like someone from Bethel calls me up and is like, you know that like your dad's name is on one of these seats, like right next to Bill. Like Bill had him come and sit next to him that weekend.
Wow.
And that was that
After the email.
After I had in no uncertain terms been like explicitly, this is what is going on. Like he's lying about the prophetic. He's using this prophetic deception to like get to like entice members of your community into vulnerable positions, and then he's abusing them. And like that is happening right now. I know for a fact, like during that same period of time, my dad was going to like the single meetings at Bethel and like trying to find women. And he was like, I'm a good friend of Bill's. Good friend. Like that was his line that he was using to try to get women during that time. And it's
So
yeah, go.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
It shouldn't work. Like my dad's 65, like, and the only reason any of it worked was because he was a hero in the community, because it's just really hard for people to like look at him and think of him as the bad guy, as the villain, because like Bill had him come up front and like the Lord clearly spoke through him. Yeah.
In no uncertain terms, Bill Johnson knows that your dad is a predator. And yet he continued to allow him to be a part of the circle, to either attend the singles group or to kind of operate. I mean, is that accurate?
Oh.
I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like, I mean, is that like, do we give Bill any benefit of the doubt of like, well, he just didn't know?
Yeah, I mean, like I get people might not believe me, right? And this is like,
sure,
but yes, 100%.
I mean, I believe you.
Yeah, and I think that people will, but like yeah, quite explicitly. To what extent? Like there is reasons to believe. I don't really even fully know, but there was something that happened in 2015 and 2017 that caused Bethel to like not deplatform, but like they stopped inviting him to come to conferences. And like I don't really know what that was about, but so he wasn't, sorry, they stopped inviting him to speak at conferences, not to come to conferences, but he was like, they stopped platforming him. They stopped like using him in like these big conferences, but behind the scenes, they were still protecting and covering for him. And I thought that Bill was totally naive to both the prophetic deception and to the sort of abuse and predation. But there's good reason to believe that he was aware, at least to some extent, of these things well before even I was. And then quite explicitly, he was very explicitly aware because I told him point blank, and he just did nothing about it. I've still never heard from him. Like I looked up to Bill a lot. Like he was a spiritual father of mine. Like I'm sure he probably doesn't feel that because there's a lot of people who look up to him, but like,
sure.
I genuinely thought he was a good guy. I thought he was a good, compassionate guy. And like, I felt bad for him that my dad was taking advantage of him. What I thought, like, it was extremely meaningful to me that like, even as an adult, even outside of like this charismatic world, like I really when I emailed Bill, like I really wanted help. I really needed help with dealing with this with my dad. I did not want to be the person who was like pioneering the "we need to stop Bob Hartley" campaign. Like that is such a horrible thing for a son to have to do. And as you can imagine, people have been horrific to me about that. Now, it doesn't really bother me because like I knew that it was something that I had to do, but like speaking up against your own father and airing out his dirty laundry, yeah, people don't like that shit. And it's like uh and so like I have taken a lot of heat for this, and like I shouldn't have had to. Like Bill should have. It 100% Bill should have been the one who was like speaking up about it.
Well, yeah. I mean, man, I'm sorry that you've had to go through that, and you're right. It shouldn't have been you. I mean, there's multiple layers of who it should have been. You know, in my opinion, as a Christian, you know, I would say that the entire church should have been like,
Yeah.
this guy shouldn't be like, he's not one of us.
Right.
This guy's not us, so he's not allowed here.
Right.
It should have been other Christians who were in the prophetic realm who, you know, had genuine desires to do God's will or whatever, speaking up against this. But yet it seems like time and time again, even the ones who seem, like you said, you know, you looked up to Bill and you're like, oh, I thought he was good. And it's like, even those seem to be covering the abusive situations. And so it's unfortunate that sometimes it's like we're sitting around, we're like, is anybody going to say anything?
Yeah.
Is anybody going to say anything? Like, don't we all see this going on? And then finally you're just like, okay, no one is going to say anything unless I do it. And so, you know, this podcast started because James River, our local church, got a little bit of media coverage last year. You may have heard of the Stronger Men's Conference,
Right.
Mark Driscoll, and there's a guy on a pole, and it was a huge fiasco. Like that got national
Such
news.
such righteous gemstones vibes.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. Actually, I don't even think they would have come up with anything
Right.
as outrageous as that.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then there was this situation where they falsely claimed that this woman regrew her toes through a prayer, and they said that they watched him actually grow, and they're like, we've got pictures, and pictures came out, and it turned out that it was totally fabricated, the entire thing. Like, it never happened. And that poor lady, they drug her through the mud too, and they, like, her past got put out everywhere, and so she kind of became a focal point of it. And anyways, so with these things, and then also Bill Johnson coming to James River, a big thing that John says is, don't listen to internet people.
Yeah.
You know, internet people, they don't know what they're talking about. You know what you're talking about. And so about Bill Johnson, he says, you know, there's a lot of people on the internet who are saying negative things about Bill Johnson, but you just tell him that your pastor's talked to him and he knows who he is. And so, you know, you can trust your pastor. Don't trust the internet people. And so we're sitting around here and we're like, nobody's going to talk about what's going on there. All that to say is that sometimes it's literally just like, all right, nobody's going to say anything.
Yeah.
And so we've got to speak up. And you know, I'd love to talk about things other than James River, and sometimes we do, but it seems like every time I'm like, we can talk about something else, they just do something. Right. And I'm like, well, we got to talk about that. Recently, the SOZO sermon he preached, it's like, we got to talk about this because this is clearly priming for Bill Johnson.
Yeah.
Bill Johnson's coming again. We got to talk about that. Like, I think people around here just view Bethel as this sort of gold standard of kind of mainstream charismatic stuff, right? Because there's like different layers. There's like the like home groups that are charismatic and kind of get into some of the more maybe crazier things. Then you have like your IHOPs, and then you have your like actual cults of like where people, you know, do mass suicides or whatever.
Right.
And they're all sort of adjacent to each other. And then you kind of have your mainstream, which is what Bethel it really is. Because I mean, their worship songs are sung in so many churches, even non-charismatic churches. They're generally just considered like an acceptable Christian church by most people within the United States, at least. Like mainstream evangelicalism, even Baptists are kind of like, well, I mean, some of them at least are like, well, Bill Johnson, whatever, he's a little weird, but hey. And I just don't think people ever stop to really look at what he actually teaches, what he actually believes, what's been said about him. And I think more and more things will come out about him, because I've heard some stories, and even what you shared today. I'm so glad you shared that, because I think people need to hear this. This is who Bill Johnson is. With our local church getting all cozy with Bill and Bethel, I think it's something that people need to be aware of. And that's one of the reasons I really wanted to, I wanted to have you on the show because I really enjoyed our conversation the other day. And I think your story is very fascinating. I think you're a very brave person, and I wanted to get to know you. But there was the other aspect of like, I want to get this this perspective out to as many people as possible.
Yeah.
And I know you've done that with, some of the stuff that you've been doing. And, but like locally, I really want people to hear these things. And, this is who Bill Johnson is. This is what Bethel is. This is what the charismatic, and, I'm not speaking every single charismatic, obviously, but that realm, that, prophetic Bill Johnson, Mike Bickle, Bob Hartley realm, right? Like, people need to know about this, because I worry that that's what's coming to our local church, and that's going to start infecting our local area. And I've heard a few stories. I can't verify them, so I haven't publicly said anything, but I've heard a few stories about our local church covering up things.
Yeah.
And I need to be able to verify that before I go public with any of those things. But if there's even rumors of it, it makes me think that it's probably true, or worse is true. And if we open the door for this kind of behavior that's happening at Bethel, I feel like it's only going to get worse, because it's a culture of secrecy. It's a culture of cover up. It's a culture of, we don't want to look bad, right? Like we don't want anybody to think that we're not really prophetic, that God's not really talking to us. So we don't want to expose Sean Bowles or anybody for anything, because that might look bad on us.
Yeah.
So here's the other aspect of our podcast that I've tried to point out is you can listen to this podcast wherever you live, because hopefully, as we expose our local church and talk about our local church, and we talk a lot about Bethel, but wherever you are in the United States or in the world, this type of theology, this type of doctrine can creep into your own churches and, your smaller churches, because these people are so influential. And so, you might live just in the middle of nowhere and attend a small church, but they're heavily influenced by Bill Johnson. And they're like, so he may never come to your church, but they may introduce those things because they like what they're doing. And so it's so bad and it's so infecting that it can infect any level of the church, whether it's a big church or small church. So that's my kind of warning to people, but I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on what you might say to church who's even thinking of kind of courting this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's so complicated, because it's the people who are at risk of being preyed upon are also the people who are within these communities, or who are sympathetic to these communities. So it's been very interesting, like, speaking up in general. Like, I very much have been wanting to sound the alarm about a lot of the corruption that is taking place. And like, I really don't think that many people have a real good grasp and understanding of like how pervasive this corruption is. And like you talk about Bethel being like a mainstream church and on that edge of like a cult. And it's like, I think it's kind of both. It's both a cult and it is mainstream. And that's kind of scary that we're seeing some like mainstream cults. And if you look at the whole like latter rain, like it's like the terminology that I've been trying to use recently is like, it's a franchise of cults. Like they're all doing the same thing and same patterns. Some are worse than others, and some are more intense than others. But they're really preying on the people who are brought into that community. So I'm wanting to sound the alarm, but it's really hard to do that in a way where I don't also want to demonize the people who are the actual victims of it. So the people who go
Sure.
to Bethel, who go to International House of Prayer, like I think that there to some extent right now is like a little bit of a moral awakening moment happening where like I think that you're seeing people kind of wake up and leave these communities, but new people are going to be grafted in, and like they prey on like young individuals. It's like the like the charismatic community is never the goal of the charismatic community is to spread the gospel, their gospel, but not to non-believers, but to other Christians. Like it's not about saving people, it's about
Mm.
radicalizing them. Like it's about converting mainline Christians to a more radical form of Christianity. And it's dangerous in softer ways of just like some of the stuff that we have talked about of like the dangers of going to an unlicensed counselor and talking about your trial. Like it's just there's ways in which you're offered quick fixes or you're offered being told that the world is different, and like same as like going to a psychic or something like that, like wanting to
Yeah.
have like supernatural fixes to everyday problems is like there's a lot of bad fruit to that. And so there's like the common sort of everyday thing, and then there's the like deeper, more insidious of like, man, the more and more you get into it, like there is just like a truly deep association of leaders who are all covering for each other in this Wild West community in which you cannot speak up against it. Like your pastor being like, "Don't listen to the internet people." It's so nefarious because there is no other way to talk about what is going on in those communities from within the community. The internet people are people who are ousted from the community. Like I would love to be able to
Yeah.
be given a pulpit and go up on the stage at Bethel and be like, here's the reality and here's the testimony that I've experienced. They have hundreds of testimonies every week of people who are healed, and not once did they ever allow someone to come up there and be like, I prayed for this person and they died. I had this
Yeah.
person give me this prophecy and I was abused by the person that I was told to marry. Or a testimony of me, like I saw my father pretend to be prophetic and he wasn't. Like no one's sharing those testimonies. So the world that the people are exposed to is not the real world. It's not the real world of even that community. Like if you want to know what the fruit of your community is, you have to listen to the people who left just as much as the people who stayed. You have to listen to all of the people that it was affected by. And then you have your pastor, along with a lot of other pastors, doing this thing of don't listen to these bitter people. Don't listen to these testimonies. Ignore the bad fruit. Only taste of this good fruit that we have prepared and plucked for you. And it's not an accident. It's like whether people are conscious of it or not, like I think you have to be once you get to a certain level of leadership, but like there are just these deeply insidious patterns all about power structures that are cannibalistic in nature. Like they eat their own community. That's why all of these communities revolve around like 18 to 22-year-olds, because you can keep finding more 18 to 22-year-olds. Like you just eat them up, spit them out and get the next group, right? Like
Yeah.
that's why it's to like burn the zeal of the youth. Is that's the oil in the lamp for them is just to keep that burning and burning through individuals. And then when you have people like me and you and others who got burnt out and we're like, hey, this is not good, there's a million different ways to dismiss our voice.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so we gotta. I love what you're doing with this podcast, and obviously that's what I'm wanting to do, and I want to be clear too, like I am not making any money off of any of this. This is all there's this like, don't listen to those internet people who are profiting off of the exploit. I'm not profiting shit, man. Like no one who speaks up against these communities makes a lick of money. I have had to spend more money than I have gotten. I have this, and I guess this will transition to like a plug for the organization that I'm starting. But I started this organization, the Rise and Reclaim Advocacy Group, that is a nonprofit organization that's supposed to be like the intention of the organization is to be a sort of middleman of like helping people who have been experienced abuse in a religious context have someone to advocate for them. So usually what that looks like is someone will do an intake, and then we will have them come in and speak to one of the different individuals that we have, one of the different advocates that we have, including myself, where we'll just like speak with someone. And it's not a counseling session. It's not like a legal advising situation. It's more just to like share, for someone to like share their story, and then we connect them to a network of like, whether it be counselors, lawyers, support groups, resources, just so that people like aren't alone. And if it's more dramatic cases, talking to lawyers and talking to news organizations and whatnot, that's like a very scary thing to do. And being able to talk with people who have kind of seen it before and walked through some of that is really helpful and whatnot. So this is an organization that me and a good friend of mine and fellow an individual who was a part of the International House of Prayer, and she experienced abuse there and is a survivor herself, and she's the founder of it, and I came alongside and helped her get it started.
Gotcha.
But
What is the name of the organization again?
it's called the Rise and Reclaim Advocacy Group.
Okay, I'll make sure that we point people to that, and so that they can check that out.
Yeah, and I would love to like unapologetically, I love to plug that. Like if people know individuals who could use that resource, there's not a whole lot of resources for someone who's abused within a church and they don't want to go to their church, I highly recommend people, if you experience abuse within your church, do not go to the church about it. And that's such a hard thing to do because that's your community. But like, find resources outside of that. Speak to people who, whether it's a different church or whether it's, if it's serious enough, go to the police. If there's physical abuse, like go to the police before you go to your church.
Is the Rise and Reclaim Advocacy Group, is that local to your area or is that a nationwide thing? Because obviously we're here in Springfield, and somebody
Right.
might say, hey, this actually sounds like something that I would like to find out more about, either to support or to utilize, because I know I've talked to a few people who have gone through spiritual abuse and things like that with our local megachurch. They might find this as a valuable resource to them. So is this something nationwide or is it just local?
No, it's definitely nationwide. I mean, it's primarily just online right now because like,
Gotcha.
so
Okay.
I'm based out of LA. Gracia Mack, who's the founder of the organization, she's based out of Minnesota, and then we both came from Kansas City. So
Okay.
the nonprofit itself is registered in Minnesota, and but yeah, we do it online, and we've had people from all over kind of that we've spoken with and done intakes with, and we're building out more of a network. This is another thing. If people are listening to this and of therapists who are informed of spiritual abuse, because this is like in my own experience, this is one of the most difficult things that I've had to deal with is every time I've gone to a therapist, it's like really hard explaining to them that my dad's a prophet. We spend the first like
Sure.
10 sessions just me trying to explain the world to them. And so having people who are both professionals and who are aware and informed on like kind of what spiritual abuse looks like, or abuse within spiritual contexts, what clergy abuse, what, having a little bit of a background in that. So we're still trying to build out the network, especially if people want to have a counselor who's in person. We have people in Kansas City, and like we have a couple of people in some of the bigger cities. But like, say if you Springfield, like I don't actually think we have anybody in Springfield, at least not that I'm aware of.
Sure.
So like, if there are individuals like who want to get in contact with the organization just to be like, hey, I know someone who could be who's like accepting new clients and it comes from this background, like that's great.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Christianity is such a weird world in and of itself to those who don't grow up in it.
Right.
And then you tack on kind of a more modern charismatic element to it,
Mhm.
and then now all of a sudden it's very foreign to, I think,
Right.
non-Christians. Even within my own church, there's a lot of people who grew up Lutheran. I didn't grow up Lutheran. It's a very liturgical church. There's no speaking in tongues. And so like I've talked with a few people, and like they don't even know what's going on in the
No. Yeah.
wider. So even explaining it to other people who I share a faith with, they
Yeah.
don't even know that there's like this whole other world of people who claim to be Christian, that it even
Yeah.
exists, or they've heard of it, but they don't really know what's going on. So yeah, I mean, let alone somebody who just is totally never grew up in it. They're like, what the heck?
Totally.
So yeah, I definitely can understand the value of finding people who are aware of it, and yeah, you don't have to like get them shorthand up to like what's going on in the world. Here, watch this documentary, listen to this podcast, read this
Yeah.
book, and then you
Yeah.
can be my therapist.
I literally, with my last therapist, I literally was like, I did tell her about some of the like podcasts that I had done, and she listened to one, and I was like, I appreciate that. She didn't charge me for that hour, so I appreciate that. But
Well, that's good. Yes.
my my partner that I'm dating right now, when we first started dating, she was like, I knew I wanted to date you, but there was a period of time where I was like, am I just dating him because he's anthropologically interesting? And because we would just she was so like, I have no grasp or grid for the world that you're in. But now it's great because she does, and it's
Jedidiah, I really appreciate your time. We've been talking for a couple hours now, and so I want to be respectful of your time. So
yeah.
I think we can kind of wrap up here. But once again, just thank you so much for giving us your time today and sharing your stories and experiences. And I know that a lot of the stuff you're talking about it's not a lot of what we talk about typically is somewhat removed, because yes, we went to James River. We know people at James River.
Mhm.
We know people who are in this world. But at the same time, there is that level of just removal, right? Like we're
Yeah.
not necessarily fully there. But what you're talking about, this is your dad. This is your
Yeah.
family. These are people you grew up with. You mentioned Bill Johnson was, you viewed him almost like a spiritual father to you. And so I know that that's got to be, at some level, no matter how many times you do it, got to be a little difficult to be like, I wish I didn't have to talk this way,
Yeah.
So I appreciate your bravery in that aspect. And I think the Rise and Reclaim advocacy group, based on what you've told me, and I went and kind of was looking at the website and Facebook page and stuff, and I'll link to all that so people can find you. But
Great. Yeah.
I think there's value in that. I really, really
Yeah.
do. And One thing that's been really beneficial, and I think it might be one of the most beneficial things about this particular podcast, is the messages that I've got from people and the comments where people say, I was at James River and it didn't sit well with me what was going on there, but I thought I was crazy.
Mm,
And now listening to your podcast, I don't think I'm crazy anymore.
yeah. Yeah.
It's some variation of that, but it's basically this idea that w- they saw red flags, they saw things, but they couldn't articulate it necessarily, or they didn't know that there were other people who were also thinking those things. And so then to expose it and be like, here's what the true gospel is, and what John's preaching is really gospel of Bill Johnson, and all those different things. Like, oh, okay, yeah, this is why I saw red flags. I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
And I think that there's so much value in helping people not feel crazy. And so I hope that your stories today help people not feel crazy
Yeah.
that have experienced those things.
No, I think that's a great and very apt description of. I've been on both sides of it in some regards. Like I think
Yeah,
5-6 years ago, a lot of my I think of a lot of my like emotional spiritual turmoil of my 20s had a lot to do with being like there is something gravely wrong and I can't identify what it is. And I some of it has been my own like, not all of my issues in my entire life boiled down to like my father and the cult that I grew up in, but a significant amount certainly can
sure.
be connected to it. But I think that something freeing has happened in the last couple of years because it's like the disease is kind of identified at this, and I think for me, and this is part of the reason why I want to speak up so confidently about it, is because like I had both the privilege and not both good and bad of being able to see a lot of this stuff behind the scenes, and I like can confidently there's very few people out there who can like confidently say that like Bill Johnson was um, corrupt behind the scenes, like and
Sure.
that this prophetic fraud is like genuinely fraudulent. Like there's a lot of, and I think there's a lot of people who like felt the symptoms of that, knew and felt the discernment of it, but like couldn't say definitively. And I think that that's really difficult place to be in, where you're like, this feels bad. Or like the SOZO is a great example of like, you might go to a church and you see people doing that and it's like, this feels off. But if I speak up and I'm like, hey, this is wrong, am I going to get shut down by a bunch of these different people who are like upset that I am speaking out against something that they find meaningful? And so, as someone who has seen behind the scenes and seen some of the more dramatic um, pitfalls and the more rotten fruit of the tree, like in some sense it's been easier for me because I can like definitively say there is a sickness here. Like this is not in my head. I'm not crazy. And I hope that people listening um, can feel that sense of like, yeah, there was something wrong. There was something really wrong, and there continues to be something wrong. And knowing that, I think, is a very like overwhelming but very enabling feeling.
Yeah. And I think it's great to, we've been talking about it from inside the church. My motivation is to reform the church essentially. But I think it's important to have voices like yours who are kind of coming from the outside and saying,
Yeah.
I lived through this, I saw this, and I can kind of you can look at it almost with more objective eyes now in some ways. And I think that there's value in at least hearing that experience. And so, yeah, I appreciate you so much, and
Yeah.
I respect you, and I've enjoyed this conversation. I enjoyed our previous conversation that we had on the phone, and you're a cool dude, and you're welcome back anytime you want. Yeah, so I will let you have the closing words for this, and yeah, once again, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I so appreciate being on here. I appreciate you and what you're doing, and the podcast that you guys have been doing and speaking up about these things. As you well know, there is not money in it, and it is like it's
That
hard
is
to.
true. So true.
There's not money, prestige, or power in any of it. So it is difficult. But I also appreciate, I don't know if you're going to cut this up into multiple ones or if it's just going to be one long one. But for
One
everybody
long one,
who's
yeah.
okay, well then for people who are listening and still listening, appreciate you guys for sticking through it and listening to everything that I or we had to say um, and yeah, I think that if I had a lasting thought is like um I think that there is a healing process that is happening right now. So I talked all day about, all of this podcast about all of the many things that are going wrong, but one really redemptive thing has been seen that people really care, like even within a community that is fully um in a charismatic world and is like fully bought in. I have seen so many individuals just have this sort of moral and character awareness. I haven't seen this in leadership, but I've seen this within the communities of people of just being like, this is wrong. And we're gonna like stand up and it's been very, very encouraging to me to have a whole lot of solidarity with people who are like, we're going to fight for truth and justice, and we're going to fight for people. We're going to fight for the people who have been abused within our community, and to see that with people who have different political views, who have different religious views, a wide spectrum of different like individuals that I've interacted with. I've definitely been, as much as I've been discouraged about like the absolute depravity of humanity that I have seen over the last several years and perhaps through my life. I've been very also encouraged that there are a lot of good people who are really, really wanting to live a good and honest and compassionate life and to fight for those who are being abused. And that's the one thing that has like made this entire experience not feel so depressing, I guess. And so I know we didn't talk about it much, but I just wanted to share a little bit about like that still is very much my perspective, is that people do care. And even within these communities, like, so final thought, I guess, would be like, if you are someone who sees like a church like James River or your local church gets taken over or infected or whatever terminology you want to say with it, like, know that that doesn't mean that the people themselves are always infected. Like they're
Right.
still very good people. And like, that's kind of a final thought.
Thank you so much for joining us today on the Bad Fruit Podcast. I hope that you found value and enjoyed the conversation that I had with Jedidiah Hartley. He's just such a cool dude, and I'm really glad that I got to share that conversation and his insight and his perspective with you. As I said at the beginning, I'm going to share all of the links to the Rise and Reclaim advocacy group down in the show notes and on our Facebook page. And once again, I would ask that you would like, subscribe, share this podcast with all of your friends. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/badfruitpodcast. If you want to email me, you can at badfruitpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you once again for listening, for joining us today, and we will talk to you next time. God bless.